What is the state and what is the future of information sharing and fraud? Hi, I'm Tom Field, Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. My pleasure to be speaking here today with Andy Smith, Senior Vice President of Enterprise Fraud with Equifax. Andy, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Tom.
Information sharing. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody says it's where we should be. In reality, where are we now?
Yeah, so, information sharing has been the standard internationally for years. In the UK, it's actually regulated that institutions do have to share fraud data. And in Canada, it's been the industry standard since 2008. Equifax was actually invited to create the fraud consortium in Canada in 2008. In the U.S., there has been traditionally a reluctance to share data. There's been the concern of proprietary data getting out. There has been just not that sort of culture of sharing. Now, in reality, fraud shops have been calling fraud shops forever. But doing it in a structured, kind of quality-controlled way is a relatively new phenomenon. The state that we're in right now is we are going to see an increase in identity fraud with the EMV shift that's coming up later this year. Now, what that'll mean is that fraud is going to migrate into online channels and into identity forms. So people are going to misrepresent themselves, or people are going to be transacting online. And when I say people, I mean fraudsters. So, and that's going to happen. We've seen that happen in the UK. We've seen it happen in Canada. That's a solid bet. So we are seeing now an increased appetite and an increased willingness to share fraud data across issuers, across cell service carriers, across telecommunications industry. We're seeing that willingness. Where we are with it right now is we have our own internal data that we're mining to get to known frauds. Additionally, we are live with a very large telecommunications provider, and we are in the process of boarding companies in the area of banking, of auto lending, shipping. We are getting inquiries as well in insurance, and even in areas like the rental car industry. There is sort of this appetite of people who bear the brunt of loss from bad identities that are eager to begin sharing the information. So it's new, it's nascent, it's growing rapidly, the data sharing, but I think it's inevitable that it's going to be an industry standard.
So in other words, the U.S. is late to the game, but the rest of the world is bringing the game to the U.S.
Yeah, a little bit. And one of the things that you've seen as well is a migration of fraud from those international locations to the U.S.
Well, that's the next place I was headed, because U.S. is late to the game with EMV. The world's bringing EMV. Migration comes with that. What are the fraud migration trends that concern you as we start to evolve our payment security?
Yeah, I think the idea of fraudsters migrating to identity fraud. Identity fraud, I find, is just more pernicious. There's more financial loss than your traditional counterfeit credit card fraud that you would see. There's an increase in professionalization as well, which is concerning. And especially as you consider the impacts of that down the road. I mean, a lot of terrorist and criminal organizations are funding operations through financial fraud. So that increase in professionalization is certainly of concern. You're going to see an uptick in account takeover. Certainly, I think that's one area that you'll see. I think you'll see as well your traditional application fraud is going to increase. One of the interesting things about where we are right now, even with all the data breaches that we're seeing, there is infinite opportunity for fraud. I mean, for identity fraud. There are so many identities out there that can be exploited that it's probably a good assumption that your identity is somewhere out there. But I think if you start removing some of the easier channels like counterfeit fraud, you're going to see more identities getting exploited. And to the U.S. consumer, that's a whole lot more inconvenient than just losing a credit card.
And a couple questions. One I'm curious about, which is what do people most misunderstand about identity fraud? And what are the identity fraud trends that really concern you the most right now?
So I think what people don't understand about identity fraud is how tremendously inconvenient it is. Frequently the financial liability for the amount that a consumer is defrauded isn't borne by the consumer. But if you look at the costs that are incurred by a consumer to get their credit straightened out, to get accounts re-originated, and it's a tremendous inconvenience, as well as just a feeling of being violated. At your most personal level, your actual identity is used by someone else. I think that's one area of concern. In terms of trends in identity fraud, one of the trends that we're seeing right now is the idea of identity farming, which is criminals or criminal organizations originating identities for the purpose of reselling those identities to the fraudsters who will then use them to exploit financial institutions. A synthetic identity can be built up over time to get to high credit limits, to get to a high degree of usability by a fraudster. And the idea that people are specializing in creating those identities, I think, is of some concern. And I've talked a lot about financial institutions and telecommunications. Some of the areas that are even more concerning, I think, are in benefits eligibility. Some of the government fraud that we're seeing right now, improper payments and things like that. Those are all areas that are seeing a lot of identity fraud as well as tax fraud.
Talk to me a bit about mobility, because we hear an awful lot about the risks that mobility brings, but mobility brings a lot of benefits in terms of fraud prevention.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a mobile environment, we haven't seen all that much fraud yet, because you can't do all that much in a mobile environment online yet. But that's going to change. Consumers are demanding these services be delivered in a mobile environment, and it's those revenue drivers that are really going to drive the expansion of it. Fraud, the fraud groups, the fraud professionals need to react, right? Because ultimately that revenue is going to drive the bus. And fraud, or the anti-fraud measures that we take, are ultimately an enabler of revenue, right? You can have zero fraud, you're just not going to have any revenue if you have zero fraud. And that's the traditional fraud conversation. The interesting thing about it is there is a fair amount of myth and fear about the mobile environment right now. In my mind, there is no more insecure instrument than a traditional credit card. It can be swiped. Those numbers are public. They are easily consumable. It's a terribly insecure instrument. I don't think that the mobile environment presents as much risk as a credit card. I think the other thing that I find encouraging is the opportunity for more points of control. So I can make a fraud determination of somebody at the point of their application for credit. Now I can make a fraud determination of somebody at the registration of the account. So that's sort of the additional point of control that I find really intriguing. I have more information on that identity than I did when it applied for credit, and it's now trying to transact online, and it becomes an opportunity to make another determination. And then, of course, as we move into the transactional space, the traditional transactional fraud defenses kick in as well. But that point of account registration is really intriguing to me.
Great insight. Andy, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Tom.
Topic has been fraud, and we've been talking about identity fraud specifically, information sharing. I've been talking with Andy Smith with Equifax. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you very much.